The desert never forgets, but people do. Dustwell, Nevada, was a place where the wind had a memory sharper than any man's. Lila Morrison had learned that lesson the hard way. For years, she'd let the wind scour her memories raw, hoping maybe one day it'd strip away the shame that clung to her name like sweat. But no amount of sand or time could erase her sister's scandal from the town's tongue, or from Lila's heart. That morning, the air trembled with heat and judgment as Lila lugged an empty water can from the main road back to her rundown shack. A battered sign still hung over the fence. Wildlife photographer available for hire. But nobody came calling anymore. Now she mostly lived off canned beans and the silence of the desert, her camera gathering dust in a kitchen drawer. As noon bled into afternoon, the wind picked up. Grit scratched at her skin, and sky turned bronze. Lila squinted through the haze and froze. A dark shape staggered on the edge of the highway, half swallowed by the rolling dust. At first she thought it was a coyote, maybe a wild Mustang blown off course. But as she got closer, a shape resolved. A horse, taller than most, ribs sharp beneath matted fur, one foreleg dragging. Blood had streaked the fetlock, dried dark against the pale coat. Flies swarmed the wounds. The animal's head hung low, every breath a shudder. Lila's boots thudded on the sun-baked asphalt. "Hey, hey there, easy now," she murmured, voice half swallowed by the wind. The horse's eyes rolled, wild with fear. Cars sped past, drivers barely glancing at the broken animal in the storm. A pickup slowed, window sliding down. "You'd best leave that thing, Lila," someone shouted. Jed Rooker, the town's hardware clerk. "It ain't your problem. Last time you meddled, look what happened." She ignored him, kneeling beside the horse, shielding its eyes from the sun. "You're okay now?" she said, though she didn't believe it. The horse flinched, sides heaving, legs threatening to buckle. Thunder rumbled in the distance, just the sound of big rigs crossing the bridge, or maybe a storm coming in. She touched the horse's neck, feeling its heartbeat drum against her palm, frantic and weak. "Come on," she whispered, and pressed her shoulder against its side. The animal was nothing but bones and terror. It took all her strength to coax him forward, step by painful step, off the burning asphalt and onto the shoulder. Blood stained the sand. Her arms burned, legs shaking as she pulled, cajoled, begged. She heard the jeers from passing cars. "Crazy woman! Leave it for the coyotes!" One voice, sharper than the rest. "You want another dead horse on your conscience, Morrison?" But Lila refused to let go. The storm swelled, turning daylight into a muddy gloom. Her eyes stung, mouth dry as cotton. She tore off her flannel shirt, draped it over the horse's back, and wrapped her hand around the dangling lead rope she'd scavenged years ago from a rancher's trash. The horse lurched, stumbled, nearly collapsed. She staggered with him, sand scraping her throat, lungs aching. The world shrank to her and the horse. No judgment, no memories, just the brutal present. Each step was a battle against the wind, against the weight of old scars. A mile later, her shack came into view, barely more than a pile of lumber and corrugated iron, set back from the road behind a field of brittle sage. The yard was empty except for a half-rotten corral and a dry water trough. Lila dragged the horse through the gate, collapsed to her knees, and pulled a rusty bucket from the porch. She filled it from her precious water supply, watching the horse gulp and cough, water spilling down its muzzle. Her hands shook. She ran them over the animal's neck, searching for wounds. There, a deep gash on the left shoulder, packed with sand and pus. Old rope burns scored the flanks, and as she brushed away dirt, she caught sight of something else. A faint mark beneath the grime, too faded to read in the dim light. But she didn't have time to think. The horse wheezed, sweat pouring off its body despite the chill creeping in with the setting sun. "You're safe," she lied, voice hoarse. "You're safe now." She tried to stand, but her knees buckled. Her hands were raw, clothes ruined. The storm battered the shack, rattling the windows, moaning through the cracked eaves. The horse swayed, legs folding, and crashed to the ground with a groan. No, please." Lila crawled to his side, pressed her hand to his flank. She fumbled for her phone, dialing the only number she knew would answer after dark. "Meredith, I need you. Now." She didn't wait for a reply. She dragged old blankets from her bed, covered the horse's shivering body, whispered prayers to gods she'd never believed in. Her vision blurred, salt and sand stinging her eyes. The last thing she remembered was the sound of hoofbeats thrumming in her memory. Her sister's laughter on a race day long ago, the crack of the starting gun, the roar of a crowd that would never forgive. The storm howled on, unyielding. Lila slumped against Shadow Dancer's side, exhaustion flooding her limbs. As darkness closed in, she realized she'd risked everything, her reputation, her safety, maybe her future, for a dying animal no one else would save. Outside, the desert waited, silent witness to another act of madness or mercy. Inside, Lila's last thought before slipping into unconsciousness was a simple, stubborn hope. Maybe this time, it would be enough. Night in the desert never feels empty. Wind whispers secrets through broken fence rails, coyotes yip at a pale moon, and every shadow stretches long. But that night, as the storm faded and Lila drifted in and out of restless dreams on the hard-packed earth, the world was utterly silent, like even the land itself was holding its breath. A sharp knock jolted Lila awake. She jerked upright, blinking blearily. The lamp on her porch flickered with every gust of wind. Through the warped glass of her door, she saw a figure, tall, thin, moving with the no-nonsense urgency of someone used to bad calls at bad hours. Dr. Meredith Lane didn't waste time with pleasantries. "Lila? Where is he?" Lila pointed weakly toward the horse, Shadow Dancer, sprawled in a heap of blankets and fear. Meredith was a track vet. Short blonde hair always pulled back, boots perpetually caked in red Nevada mud. She knelt at the horse's side, her hands deft and steady even as her face tightened in worry. "What the hell happened?" she muttered, already running a gloved hand over the trembling animal. "He's burning up. Fever, dehydration. Did he eat?" "Water. Barely," Lila croaked. "I did what I could. He was out by the highway, left to die." Meredith set her jaw, voice taut. "Help me. Get the antibiotics from my bag. We need cold compresses, anything to drop his temperature." For the next hour, Lila moved like a ghost, fetching what Meredith demanded. Ice packs wrapped in towels, syringes, iodine, suture kits. Some things pilfered from old medical boxes, others scavenged from her own meager supplies. Outside, the town's lights glimmered faintly through the storm's dying tail, a reminder of all the people who wouldn't help. Meredith swore under her breath as she worked. "He's not a Mustang. Look at those legs, racing blood. God, he's a mess." Sweat poured off both women as they scrubbed wounds, cooled fevered flesh, and whispered encouragement to the struggling horse. Dawn crept slow and silver over the horizon. Lila felt herself wobbling, head spinning, but refused to stop. Then Meredith paused. "What's this?" she murmured. She wiped a muddy flank with a rag. There, half hidden under layers of filth and dried blood, was a raised mark burned into the horse's skin, a brand, faded but unmistakable. Meredith's eyes widened. No, it can't be. She glanced at Lila, dread pooling in her voice. You recognize that? Lila's throat closed. She stared, numb, as a familiar shape resolved in the dawn light, a stylized crown above two intertwined letters, S and M. The brand of Sun Mountain Stables, her family's old legacy. The same brand from the tabloid headlines, the scandal, the fall. He's one of ours, Lila whispered. He was my sister's. The truth came crashing back. Years ago, after the scandal, doping, bribery, the disappearance, every horse tied to the Morrison name had been auctioned, scattered, or lost. Now, here was one, broken and discarded, bleeding in her own yard. Meredith's jaw clenched. You know what this means, right? If the wrong people find out. Lila shook her head, panic clawing up her spine. We can't let them. He won't survive another move. He barely survived this. Before they could say more, the crunch of gravel cut through the quiet. Headlights slashed across the fence. A black SUV pulled up, doors slamming. 3 men in dark jackets, faces hard as stone, strode up the path. The leader was a man Lila recognized. Paul Redman, Nathaniel Graves's right hand. Graves was the kingpin of Dustwell's racing underworld, the one who'd profited most from her family's ruin. Paul's voice was ice. Morning, Lila. Got an early call from someone said you were harboring a stray. You know the law. Mustangs get picked up by the county. He's not a Mustang, Meredith snapped, stepping in front of Lila. He's private property. I'm his vet. Paul smirked, unfazed. Property, huh? You got papers? He didn't wait for an answer. Nathaniel wants that horse. Says it's dangerous, maybe sick. Can't have diseased animals running loose, can we? His men moved to circle the corral, eyes glinting. Lila's heart pounded. He's mine, she said, voice trembling. You have no right. Paul sneered. You got a court order? Thought not. Do yourself a favor, Lila. Turn him over. Don't make us come back. Meredith put a hand on Lila's arm, voice low. Don't fight them. He needs time. We'll figure something out. Paul's eyes narrowed. Tick-tock, Morrison. You got till sundown. He tossed a business card at her feet and stalked back to his truck, gravel spitting under his tires. The silence after they left was worse than the storm. Meredith squeezed Lila's hand, trying to steady her. We have to hide him. Someone tipped them off. Lila looked at Shadow Dancer, frail and battered, marked by the past. She thought of her sister, vanished without a trace, and the years of running from her own name. No more, she decided. Not this time. I'm not giving him up, she whispered, almost daring the desert to defy her. They'll have to go through me first. As the first true sunlight warmed the desert floor, Lila squared her shoulders. She didn't know how she would fight Graves and his men, or what secrets still lurked in Shadow Dancer's wounds. But for the first time since the scandal, she felt something spark deep inside, a stubborn, reckless hope. And somewhere beyond the fence, the desert wind seemed to whisper back, promising that the past never stays buried forever. When the men finally left and the dust settled, Lila slumped against the warped corral gate, her knuckles white and her heart pounding loud enough to drown out the distant howl of coyotes. The sun was climbing, a harsh white disk already burning away the memory of last night's storm. Shadow Dancer lay still in the shade, his breathing ragged, but his eyes, once wild, now tracked Lila's every move. She could feel it, fear, suspicion, and a question that lingered between them. Why try to save what everyone else has given up on? Lila brushed herself off and made her way inside, pausing just long enough to fill a cracked mug with water and splash her face. The reflection in her chipped bathroom mirror looked like a stranger. Sallow skin, grit-streaked cheeks, eyes red from dust and worry. But there was a flicker of something else, too. A stubbornness she hadn't seen in years. She found Shadow Dancer trying to stand, legs trembling. For a moment, Lila just watched. She knew better than to rush a wounded animal. Years photographing wild horses out on the open range had taught her patience, silence, and how trust was something earned grain by grain. She crouched, letting her voice settle into something gentle. "Hey you, don't try to impress me. You survived the desert. That's plenty tough for one day." His ears flicked. He didn't bolt when she reached out with a small piece of apple, just sniffed, lips quivering, before snatching it with a desperate, shaking bite. "Easy. That's it." She smiled. "I'd be scared too." From behind her, a gravelly voice cut through the peace. "You're making a lot of folks nervous, Morrison." Lila's heart jerked. She turned and found Sheriff Hank Collier leaning against his battered SUV by the fence. Hat tipped low, mustache bristling, eyes hidden behind mirrored sunglasses. He was built like a barn door, broad-shouldered and slow-moving, but Lila knew from old photos on the sheriff's office wall that he'd once been quick as a snake. "Morning, Hank." Lila stood, arms folded. "Just tending to a friend." Hank glanced at Shadow Dancer. "Heard there was trouble out here last night. Some folks say you're harboring a sick horse, maybe one tied up in old business." Lila bristled, but there was no malice in the sheriff's voice, just a tired weariness. "He's not hurting anybody. He was left to die. That's all you need to know." Hank sighed. "You got the right to help any animal you want, Lila. But you know how things go in Dustwell. People talk. Nathaniel Graves listens." Lila met his gaze, steady. "Is that a warning?" He shook his head slowly. "It's a favor. I know you. I know what you lost." The silence between them stretched, full of things unsaid. Hank finally said, "Just be careful, and call if you need me." He tipped his hat, left a small sack of oats at the gate, and drove off, his truck rumbling into the shimmering heat. Lila stood there, fingers brushing the rough wood, and felt something shift. Maybe the town's law wasn't completely blind after all. Back inside the fence, she set to work. She cleaned Shadow Dancer's wounds with salt water, each touch gentle, each motion slow. He flinched at first, but let her work, eyes darting to hers as if trying to read her intentions. The morning slipped into afternoon. Shadows shrank beneath the relentless sun. The two of them moved in quiet rhythm, she working, he enduring, the silence broken only by the sigh of the wind and the occasional crunch of apple. She thought of her sister, Allison, who'd once been the queen of Sun Mountain stables. Brave, stubborn, unafraid. They'd grown up in a world of fine horses and high stakes, until the scandal shattered everything. Accusations of cheating, missing prize money, doping rumors. And then Allison vanished, leaving Lila behind to pick up the pieces and weather the storm. That memory pressed down on her now, as she combed through Shadow Dancer's tangled mane. "You remind me of her, you know. Strong, proud, too stubborn to die, even when folks want you gone." He snorted, as if in reply, then tentatively nudged her palm. Lila let herself smile for the first time in days. "All right, maybe we're both a little broken, but we're still here, aren't we?" Day after day, she tended to him. The rhythm of care, the gentle washing, The slow walks around the yard, the soft words, became a balm for them both. Some mornings, she'd wake before dawn, find him standing at the edge of the corral, silhouetted against a bruised blue sky. She'd climb the fence, camera slung over her shoulder, and they'd walk together, silent and steady, until the sun crested the horizon and painted gold over everything. One afternoon, a pair of neighborhood kids, drawn by curiosity and whispers, peered through the fence. Lila let them feed Shadow Dancer a handful of oats. The boy, maybe 12, gawked. "He's huge. What happened to him?" Lila shrugged. "Life, but he's getting better." The girl asked, "Does he have a name?" Lila looked at the horse, then at the sky. "Shadow Dancer," she said, the words feeling like an old song finally remembered. As the days blurred by, trust grew. Shadow Dancer's coat lost its dullness, his eyes brightened, and his wounds began to heal. At sunset, Lila would sit by the fence watching him graze, and for a little while the ghosts of her past seemed quieter. But Dustwell was never quiet for long. Rumors were already swirling, old wounds were opening, and Lila knew the peace wouldn't last. But for now, in the hush of the desert dusk, she found something like hope in the bond she and Shadow Dancer had begun to build. And maybe, just maybe, that was enough to face whatever storm might come next. The desert had a way of hiding things: bones, broken dreams, even entire lives. For Lila, every day since Shadow Dancer's rescue was a lesson in digging beneath the surface, unearthing truths that Dustwell preferred to leave buried. The morning after the menacing visit from Nathaniel Graves's crew, Lila found herself pacing the corral, watching the horse sleep. Shadow Dancer lay curled, a patchwork of scars and fresh wounds, ribs rising with each shallow breath. The air still felt heavy, as if last night's threats hadn't quite cleared. Meredith arrived just after sunrise, bringing with her a battered briefcase and a look of grim determination. She didn't bother with coffee. "We need to talk," she said, her voice softer than usual. "Let's walk." They left the shelter behind, wandering into the sand dunes, their boots stirring up tiny storms. Meredith waited until they were out of earshot of the road, then knelt and unlatched her case, spreading papers and faded photographs across the ground. "These are from my years at the track," she said, picking up a photo of herself in a crisp white vet coat. "I saw things, Lila. Things I can't forget." Her hands trembled as she flipped to a photo of a young colt, wild-eyed and terrified, a burn mark still fresh on his flank. "They used us like tools. Horses, too. Nobody cared if they broke down, not as long as the money kept coming in." Lila scanned the paperwork. Vet reports, incident logs, even some hush-hush notes in Meredith's careful handwriting. "Why are you showing me this now?" "Because," Meredith answered, "the scar on Shadow Dancer isn't just a mark of the past. It's evidence. I remember seeing a horse like him before the scandal, and I remember who was there the night your sister disappeared." The wind kicked up, sending sand spinning through the files. Lila's heart hammered. "You think the same people who ruined my family, who maybe hurt my sister, are behind all this?" Meredith nodded. Nathaniel Graves wasn't just a gambler. He controlled everything: the races, the payouts, even the horses that vanished when they stopped winning. I tried to expose him once. He threatened my license. I barely kept my job. For a moment, neither woman spoke. Lila stared out at the horizon, the sun painting gold across endless dunes. "I always wondered what really happened to Daisy," she murmured, voice catching. "All these years, I blamed myself for leaving. I thought if I'd just stayed. Don't, Meredith interrupted gently. You couldn't have saved her alone. But together, maybe we can bring some of this to light. If we find out who branded Shadow Dancer after the scandal, we might finally have proof. A silence fell between them, heavy and unresolved. Lila knelt and traced the shape of the brand in the sand, a crude crown above the intertwined S and M. She remembered Daisy's voice, bright and defiant, ringing out above the thunder of hooves. "We make our own luck, Lila." It was a lie. Luck, in Dustwell, belonged to the cruel and the cunning. They headed back to the shelter, determination knotting between them. Lila spent the day cleaning Shadow Dancer's wounds, hands gentle as she dabbed ointment over scars old and new. The horse's eyes tracked her, calmer now, trusting her touch. For the first time, he let her run a brush through his tangled mane, though he still shied from sudden movements. Between chores, Lila dug out her old camera, dusted it off, and snapped photos of the brand, of the wounds, of Shadow Dancer standing tall despite it all. "Documentation," Meredith advised. "If anything happens, we'll need proof." The sun dipped low, painting the world in fire. Meredith lingered on the porch, eyes on the horizon. "I used to think I could fix things by myself," she confessed. "Patch a tendon, stitch a wound, and the world would be right again. But the cruelty at the track runs deeper. It's in the silence, the bribes, the fear." Lila sat beside her, listening to the desert's hush. "You ever wish you'd left?" she asked. Meredith shook her head. "Not anymore. Not since you called me last night." As dusk settled, Shadow Dancer edged closer to the porch, drawn by their voices. He nosed Lila's palm, then let Meredith scratch his cheek, snorting softly. In that moment, something shifted, a fragile piece, a spark of hope. The pain hadn't vanished, but it had meaning now. They were no longer fighting alone. Later, Lila sat in her small kitchen, looking over the day's photos. She paused at one, Shadow Dancer, head bowed, the brand clear as day. She texted a copy to Meredith, who replied within seconds. "We'll start here. Tomorrow, we find out who still fears the truth." As the house creaked and the desert cooled, Lila closed her eyes and listened to the steady breathing of the horse outside. She remembered what Daisy once told her after a bad fall. "You only heal in places that hurt. That's how you know you're alive." That night, for the first time in years, Lila allowed herself to hope. The secrets buried in the sand were starting to surface, and with them maybe the chance to rewrite her family's story. The desert, after all, hid nothing forever. The next week in Dustwell unspooled with the slow agony of a rope tightening. Lila could sense the change before she saw it. The air grew thick with rumor. Stares sharpened in the post office, and the world felt as if it were holding its breath, waiting for something to break. It started small, subtle, almost laughable. Her daily trip to refill water at the corner store became a gauntlet of cold shoulders and half-heard whispers. "That's Morrison, the one with the stolen horse. Did you hear what she's up to?" Even the girl behind the register, once friendly, avoided Lila's eyes as she handed over her change. Back at the shelter, the real trouble began. One afternoon, Lila turned on the tap, and nothing came out but a dry cough of air. She tried the hose in the yard. Same. The trough was nearly empty, and Shadow Dancer looked at her with anxious eyes, flaring his nostrils as if he could sense the panic rising in her chest. She spent the next hour hauling buckets from the neighbor's old well, sweat burning her face as she sloshed back and forth in the relentless sun. Each trip felt like a message. You're not wanted here. By sundown, the next blow landed. Lila returned from the well to find the supply shed door ajar. Inside, sacks of feed had been ripped open, the contents scattered and spoiled. Someone had slashed holes in the water barrels, letting what little she had drain into the sand. The word thief was carved into the wood with a hunting knife, the fresh gouges still raw and pale. A bitter chill crept down her spine. She looked up to see Meredith pulling into the drive, dust billowing around her truck. "Someone sending a message," Lila said, holding up the ruined feed. Meredith swore softly, then went to check Shadow Dancer. The horse flinched at the commotion, but relaxed as Meredith murmured quietly, running a calming hand down his neck. "We'll figure this out," Meredith said. "I'll get more supplies tomorrow, but—" "Lila, it's not safe. This is just the start." That night, as the moon rose over the shelter, Lila found herself pacing the fence line, lantern in hand. She could feel eyes on her, even if she couldn't see them. Was it paranoia, or was someone really out there watching? In the silence, her mind reeled back to the sound of Paul Redmond's threats, to the memory of her sister's frightened voice years ago. Fear pressed in tight, but stubbornness burned hotter. "You're not running me off," she whispered to the desert. "Not again." Days blurred into each other. The next morning, Lila found a fresh scorch mark burned into her fence, a crudely drawn crown with the initials SM, just like Shadow Dancer's brand. The message was clear. She wasn't just being threatened, she was being watched. She snapped a photo, sent it to Meredith, and locked every door behind her. The town's suspicion grew. At the feed store, the clerk refused her service. "Under orders from Mr. Graves," he said, voice flat. "You want trouble, Lila, go elsewhere." She stared him down, but her hands shook as she walked away empty-handed. Things escalated when a brick came crashing through her kitchen window late one night, scattering glass across the floor. Attached was a note in jagged block letters. "Give up the horse or you're next." Lila called the sheriff, voice trembling. Hank Collier arrived within 20 minutes, flashlight and pistol at his hip. He surveyed the damage, jaw tight. "You sure it's not just kids?" he asked. But his eyes told a different story. He knew this was bigger than a prank. "I'll increase patrols, Lila, but you need to lay low, understand? Graves doesn't play fair. I can't protect you if you put yourself in the crosshairs." Lila bristled. "I can't just hand him over. Shadow Dancer's a witness, Hank. Maybe the only one who can tie Graves to what happened." The sheriff sighed, scrubbing a hand over his face. "Just be careful. This town, it protects its own, and sometimes that means looking the other way." But not everyone looked away. That afternoon, as Lila patched the broken window, she noticed a group of local kids lingering at the edge of her property. She recognized a few: Mariah, who used to help with her garden; Jonah, whose mother worked at the diner. They watched from a distance, curiosity and fear mingling in their eyes. Finally, Mariah stepped forward. "Miss Lila, can we see the horse?" Her voice was timid but sincere. Lila hesitated, then nodded. "You can, but you have to be gentle. He's been hurt enough." The children approached slowly, whispering encouragement to Shadow Dancer, who sniffed their hands with cautious interest. For a moment, the gloom lifted. Lila saw hope flicker in their faces, saw the stirrings of something stronger than fear. But the reprieve was brief. That evening, Meredith showed up with bad news. She'd received a threatening call at the clinic, warning her to stop helping Lila or risk losing her license. Her tires had been slashed in the parking lot. "They're getting desperate," Meredith said, eyes hard. "But I'm not backing down. Not now." Pressure mounted from all sides. Lila's allies grew fewer, her enemies more emboldened. Even Sheriff Collier was forced to make a choice: protect Lila or preserve the uneasy peace Graves maintained in Dustwell. As the sun set, painting blood across the desert sky, Lila stood in the yard with Shadow Dancer stroking his battered neck. She felt small but unyielding. Every scar, every act of sabotage, every whispered threat was fuel for the fire inside her. She would not be broken, not by Graves, not by the town, not by the ghosts of her own past. Somewhere in the twilight, a coyote howled, defiant and wild. Lila listened, heart pounding with the knowledge that the fight was far from over. Lila's hands trembled as she counted the last of the canned food, stacking them neatly beside a half-empty bag of oats. Each item felt like it weighed 100 pounds. The vandalism and threats hadn't stopped. They'd only grown bolder, creeping into every hour, every breath. Each sunset brought a fresh wave of dread. Even Shadow Dancer paced the paddock now, spooking at every strange sound, his recovery threatened by the stress pressing in on all sides. That Friday, just after dawn, a battered sedan with county plates rumbled up the dirt road. Two men in official windbreakers stepped out, clipboards in hand, faces set in bureaucratic indifference. Lila's stomach dropped. She recognized the emblem: Nevada Racing Authority. She barely had time to hide her fear before they were knocking at the battered door. "Ms. Morrison?" The taller agent flashed his badge. "We've received a report of an illegal animal being harbored on this property. We're here to inspect your livestock records." Her blood ran cold. "He's not stolen," she managed, voice barely above a whisper. "He was abandoned. I rescued him." The shorter agent smirked. "That's not what we've been told. You're on thin ice, Ms. Morrison. If the animal is determined to be property of the Sun Mountain stables, or part of an ongoing investigation, it'll be seized." Lila's chest tightened. She glanced out at Shadow Dancer, who stood in the corral, ears pinned flat, body tense as a coiled spring. He seemed to know he was in danger. She played for time. "Let me get my paperwork. Please wait outside." Once inside, she grabbed her phone with shaking hands and texted Meredith, "They're here. Racing Authority. I think Graves sent them. Help." She tried to calm herself as she rifled through old files, vet records, adoption certificates, even her wildlife photography permits, anything that could buy time. The agents grew impatient, banging on the door. When she finally reappeared, the tall one snatched the documents, scanning with barely disguised contempt. "We'll be back with a warrant if we need it," he threatened. "In the meantime, don't move the animal. That's a felony." He tossed her papers on the porch and left, dust swirling in their wake. As soon as they were gone, Lila collapsed on the steps, head in her hands. The last line had been crossed. This wasn't just harassment anymore. It was open war. Meredith arrived half an hour later, hair still damp from a hurried shower, eyes wide with worry. "We can't wait any longer," she said, breathless. "They're going to take him. Graves won't stop until Shadow Dancer is gone. Or worse." Lila wiped her face, exhaustion giving way to raw determination. "We move him tonight. The old preserve across the border. There's a safe paddock, and nobody from Dustwell can touch him there." Meredith hesitated. "It's risky, Lila. If we get caught—" "I don't care," Lila cut in, voice hoarse but unyielding. I'd rather go to jail than let them hurt him again. But I can't do it alone. Meredith nodded, her resolve matching Lila's. We'll need help. Someone who knows the trails, someone who won't talk. They didn't have to look far. That afternoon, Mariah and Jonah appeared at the gate along with 2 more local teens. Word had spread, as it always did in small towns. But not all the whispers were cruel. The kids had seen the sabotage, the threats, the battered horse growing stronger each day. We want to help, Mariah said, her chin lifted stubbornly. We know the back trails better than anyone. For a moment, Lila felt the sting of hope, sharp and clean. She drew them inside, quickly outlining the plan. Move Shadow Dancer after midnight, through the old arroyo and across the dried-up riverbed, all the way to the preserve on the state line. Meredith would drive the truck with supplies. The kids would act as scouts, warning of any trouble on the road. It was a reckless gamble, but no one flinched. That night, as the last red light faded from the sky, the little team gathered in the shadows of the shelter. Meredith checked Shadow Dancer's legs one final time, tightening his makeshift halter, whispering soothing words. The horse seemed to understand, his breathing slow and steady despite the tension in the air. Sheriff Collier arrived just as they were about to set out. He parked far down the road, headlights off, boots silent on the gravel. Lila's heart leapt. Was he here to stop them? Instead, the sheriff handed her a battered flashlight and looked her straight in the eye. I can't be seen helping you, Lila, but I can give you a head start. Graves's men are patrolling the East Road tonight. Take the riverbed, and good luck. It wasn't much, but it was everything. As midnight approached, the desert was hushed and still, the sky heavy with the promise of rain. The small caravan slipped through the shadows, feet silent in the sand, hearts pounding with fear and hope. Mariah and Jonah rode ahead on battered bikes, watching for lights, ready to double back if they spotted trouble. Every noise made Lila jump. The distant wail of a coyote, the crunch of gravel, the far-off rumble of engines. But she kept going, step by painful step, one hand on Shadow Dancer's lead rope, the other clutching her flashlight. Twice they had to hide in the deep sagebrush as trucks thundered past, headlights sweeping the empty road. Once Meredith doubled back to scatter their tracks, careful to leave no trace for Graves's men. The air was electric with danger. But they pressed on, inch by inch, driven by desperation and something like faith. Finally, as the first gray light of dawn broke over the hills, they reached the wire fence marking the state preserve. Lila stopped, breathless and shaking, eyes stinging with tears. We made it, she whispered. You're safe now, boy. The victory was fragile, tenuous as the dawn. But for the first time in weeks, hope felt real. The desert is never truly silent, but on the night of their escape, every sound seemed amplified. The distant howl of a coyote, the whisper of wind through sagebrush, the rapid beat of Lila's own heart as she waited in the inky blackness behind her shelter. The sky was painted with a crescent moon, casting long shadows that shifted restlessly across the sand. Shadow Dancer stood beside her, eyes wide, muscles trembling beneath his battered coat. Meredith tightened the final strap on the horse's halter, hands gentle but urgent. Around them, the small band of teenagers crouched with their bikes, faces tense and eyes darting between the road and the open desert. Jonah checked his phone for the 3rd time in 5 minutes, nerves jangling. The East Road is clear, he whispered, but there's movement by the old mill, could be Graves's men. Lila's mind raced through every possible disaster. A tire blowing out, shadow dancer spooking and running, headlights sweeping over them before they could melt into the dunes. She forced herself to breathe, steady and slow. "Everyone knows their jobs," she said quietly, her voice steadier than she felt. "Mariah, Jonah, you scout ahead. Meredith, you follow with the supplies. I'll lead Shadow Dancer. If anything goes wrong, we scatter. Meet at the creek crossing." They moved in silence. Jonah and Mariah slipped out first, wheels crunching softly on gravel, headlights blacked out, only the occasional glimmer from a phone screen marking their path. Lila led Shadow Dancer through the back gate, boots sinking into cool sand. Every step felt heavier, as if the desert itself was testing her resolve. They crossed the empty field, skirting the edge of the dried-up riverbed. Twice Lila had to stop and calm Shadow Dancer, who spooked at a sudden gust of wind or the far-off sound of an engine. Meredith whispered to him, low and soothing, her words rolling through the darkness like a lullaby. The kids signaled back, all clear. But halfway to the preserve, a pair of headlights crested the hill behind them. For a moment, panic threatened to break the group apart. "Down! Everyone down!" Lila hissed, ducking behind a tumble of rocks. Meredith pulled Shadow Dancer low, shielding him with her own body. The teens pressed themselves into the scrub, bikes hidden under sage. The truck rolled closer, engine growling, then slowed. A man's voice barked orders, too far away to catch, but close enough to chill the blood. Lila's heart pounded. She pressed her cheek to the sand, breathing in the sharp scent of earth and fear, her body aching with the need to move, but knowing any sudden sound could doom them all. Minutes ticked by, stretching unbearably. The truck finally moved on, tires spinning in loose dirt. Lila waited until the red taillights disappeared over the rise, then rose shakily to her feet. "We keep going," she whispered. They skirted the edge of a scrubby arroyo, sticking to the shadows. Above them, the wind began to howl, carrying with it the taste of a storm. Thunder growled in the far distance, and a wall of dust began to roll in from the west. "Of course," Lila muttered, as if we needed more trouble. The group moved faster now, urgency sharpening every movement. Sand stung their faces as the first gusts hit. The desert became a blur, moon, dust, the silhouette of Shadow Dancer's head beside her. Mariah rode back, her scarf pulled up over her nose. "There's a roadblock by the cattle gate," she said, barely audible over the wind. "3 men, and they're looking for someone." Lila's mind spun. She glanced at Meredith, who nodded. "We cut through the dry wash. It'll be rough, but it'll get us around them." With the storm closing in, they plunged into the wash, the ground rough and uneven beneath their feet. Lila slipped, catching herself on a boulder, knees scraping open. Shadow Dancer stumbled but kept moving, ears laid flat, nostrils flaring with every new sound. The wind whipped at them, carrying grit into their eyes and mouths. The world shrank to a tunnel of dust and fear and hope. Behind them, shouts rang out. Graves's men had noticed something was off. Flashlights swept the darkness, slicing through the sandstorm in ragged beams. "Go!" Lila urged, half dragging, half leading the horse. Jonah and Mariah ditched their bikes, taking off on foot to draw attention away. Meredith turned back, her silhouette swallowed by the swirling dust, shouting at the men, "Hey! Over here!" Her voice rising in a desperate, angry taunt. The chaos gave Lila and Shadow Dancer the opening they needed. Sheriff Collier appeared out of the dark, his voice tight but determined. "This way! Cut through the cattle fence! Quick!" Lila didn't hesitate. She followed him through a narrow gap, Shadow Dancer nearly panicking as wire snagged his flank. They burst into open ground just as the first fat raindrops began to fall, turning the dust into thick mud. Finally, on the far side of the border fence, Lila stopped, chest heaving. The horse trembled beneath her hand, but he was still standing. She looked at Collier, who nodded. "This is as far as I can go. After tonight, I have to walk away, Lila. You understand?" She nodded, fighting tears. "Thank you. For everything." Collier tipped his hat and vanished into the storm. Lila turned to Shadow Dancer, voice breaking. "You have to go now. You have to be free." She unclipped his lead, pushing open the gate to the preserve. The horse hesitated, looking back one last time before bolting into the wild, his mane streaming in the rain. Lila collapsed to her knees, tears mixing with the mud. She watched until Shadow Dancer disappeared, heart aching but full. For the first time, she understood what real love meant. Letting go, no matter how much it hurt. The storm swallowed her cries, but in the heart of the desert, a new hope was born. When dawn broke over Dustwell, the world seemed scrubbed raw and new by the desert storm, but nothing felt the same. Lila woke with aching bones and a heavy heart. The memory of Shadow Dancer's wild silhouette burned behind her eyelids. For a long time, she sat on the porch, clutching a mug of weak coffee, listening to the slow, uncertain quiet of a town that was, for once, unsure of itself. By midday, news of the midnight chase had already started to leak through the cracks of Dustwell's silence. There were whispers at the feed store, rumors at the diner, and a heavy tension at the sheriff's office. Nathaniel Graves was furious. His men combed the desert and spread threats in every corner, demanding answers no one wanted to give. But this time, something had changed. The townsfolk who once sneered at Lila now avoided her eyes, or, in rare moments, offered a nod of respect. It was subtle, but it meant the world. Inside the shelter, Lila sat at her battered kitchen table, sorting through evidence. Photos of Shadow Dancer's wounds, the branded fence, scraps of threatening notes. Meredith arrived soon after, her face pale but determined. "We've got one shot at this," she said, laying a USB drive on the table. "I got it. Recordings, emails, logs, everything Graves's men ever threatened me with. And Mariah and Jonah? They filmed the chase last night from the hilltop." Lila stared at the small drive. "Will it be enough?" Meredith nodded. "It has to be. I already called a friend at the state racing board. She's driving in tomorrow with the feds." The day passed in anxious waiting. Lila and Meredith reviewed the evidence again and again, rehearsing what they'd say, the way survivors do when the truth finally feels close enough to touch. Sheriff Collier stopped by just before dusk, his expression worn but resolute. "You sure about this?" he asked, voice low. "I have to be," Lila answered. "This is bigger than me. It's about every horse, every family Graves ruined. About Daisy." Collier nodded, jaw clenched. "You'll testify?" "I will." By the time the investigators arrived, badged, solemn, and stone-faced, the town was buzzing. Graves tried to block their path at the shelter gate, blustering about property rights and privacy, but this time, nobody backed him up. Meredith handed over the USB, and the kids shared their video. Collier vouched for Lila's story. Slowly, painstakingly, the web began to unravel. The evidence was damning. Threats against Meredith, blackmail emails, proof that Graves had ordered horses like Shadow Dancer disappeared if they lost races or threatened to reveal the rigged system. Testimonies from Meredith and the kids confirmed the timeline. Lila's photos showed not only cruelty, but a pattern, a legacy of abuse that led right to Graves's door. It all came out, piece by piece, in the cramped hearing room of the county building. The townspeople packed the halls, listening in stunned silence as secrets tumbled into the light. Lila's hands shook as she described the night she found Shadow Dancer on the highway, the brands that matched her family's ruined legacy, the threats, the sabotage, and finally, the desperate escape through the desert storm. Meredith took the stand next, her voice unwavering. She spoke of her years as a track vet, the animals lost to greed, and the price of silence. "We let this happen," she said, her gaze sweeping the room. "We can't keep looking away." When Graves's turn came, he blustered and lied, but the evidence was overwhelming. The feds arrested him on the spot, charging him with cruelty, racketeering, and witness intimidation. His men melted into the crowd, no longer bold, stripped of power now that the town had found its voice. In the aftermath, the change was immediate. The racing board suspended Dustwell's circuit pending a full investigation. Other towns sent inspectors, and whispers of reform spread across the region. People began to speak out, old wounds surfacing, new truths being told. But the victory was bittersweet. That evening, Lila walked the edge of the desert, the sky bruised purple and gold. She felt the emptiness left by Shadow Dancer's absence, an ache that throbbed every time the wind shifted. Meredith joined her, carrying 2 mugs of tea. "He'll be okay, you know," Meredith said softly. "Out there, wild again. You gave him a chance no one else ever would." Lila nodded. "I just wish Daisy could see it. I wish she knew it wasn't for nothing." "She knows," Meredith answered, resting a hand on her shoulder. "And so does this town. You changed things, Lila, for all of us." The next day, Lila gave her formal statement. She stood in front of the authorities, the town, and her own ghosts, telling the story that Dustwell had tried so hard to bury. When she finished, there was no applause, just a solemn, reverent silence, heavy with the promise that things would not return to the way they were. As she stepped outside, children from the neighborhood ran up to her, asking if Shadow Dancer would ever come back. "Maybe," she told them with a soft smile. "But even if he doesn't, we'll always remember him, and we'll protect the others." That night, the desert wind felt different. Instead of secrets, it carried the faint hope of something new. A town no longer ruled by fear, a broken legacy beginning to mend, and a woman finally free to remember her sister without shame. Summer in Dustwell lingered long after the trial. The fierce sun baked the streets, and the courthouse steps, once a stage for drama and whispered judgment, stood empty and clean. Lila Morrison stood there now, blinking in the midday light, her hands tucked in the pockets of her faded jeans, feeling the town's gaze finally shift from suspicion to something warmer. Curiosity, maybe even respect. The week after Graves's arrest, the local community center held its annual Desert Days festival, a time for crafts, food, laughter, and, this year, healing. Lila had avoided public events for years, always haunted by her family's scandal. But today, she let herself be pulled into the crowd. It started with a single conversation, Mariah waving her over, asking if she'd help set up a table for animal welfare. Soon, others joined. Jonah with his shy grin, the old storekeeper with an apologetic nod, even Sheriff Collier, who handed out lemonade from under a string of battered banners. At first, Lila felt exposed. She kept expecting to hear her old names: troublemaker, thief, Morrison. Instead, she heard thanks. A mother told her quietly that her kids now asked questions about the races, about fairness and kindness, not just winning. Another woman pressed her hand, whispering, "I lost a brother to that world. I wish I'd spoken up sooner." Even the mayor stopped to thank her for her courage. In each face, Lila saw relief. Some wounds could finally breathe. When her turn to speak came, Lila hesitated, her heart thundering in her chest. The microphone trembled in her hand. She looked out at the crowd. Sunburned ranchers, school kids, dusty hats, and Sunday dresses, all waiting. "I don't have all the answers," she began, her voice rough with emotion. "But I know what it's like to feel alone, to be told you're wrong for standing up, for caring. The truth is, sometimes standing up means standing alone. That's how change begins." She let her words hang in the air. The room was so quiet, she could hear the hum of the old air conditioner, the distant yip of a coyote outside. We all saw what happened to Shadow Dancer, and before him, to my sister Daisy. We looked away because it was easier, but easy isn't right. We have to have the courage to break the silence. Lila paused, searching for the words she'd wanted to say for years. Letting go doesn't mean forgetting. It means loving enough to set something free. To trust that if you do the right thing, maybe, just maybe, others will find their voice too. Jonah and Mariah sat in the front row, listening intently. Meredith stood off to the side, pride clear in her eyes. Lila finished. "Healing doesn't happen overnight. The wounds in this town, in our hearts, and in the animals we care for, they'll take time. But every act of kindness, every truth spoken, helps. We owe it to ourselves and to every living thing that depends on us." She left the stage to quiet applause that quickly grew, warm and genuine. It was not the roar of a racetrack crowd. It was better. It was acceptance. That afternoon, Lila wandered the festival, letting herself be pulled into small moments she'd once missed. Helping a child braid wildflowers into her hair, tasting spicy chili from a neighbor's booth, sitting in the shade with old friends she'd thought lost. For the first time, she felt present, not haunted, not hunted, but part of something larger. Later, as dusk painted the desert in honeyed gold, Lila found herself alone by the edge of town. The wind carried the scents of fried dough and sage, the laughter of children echoing in the distance. She knelt, letting the dry earth sift through her fingers. In the hush, memories of Daisy surfaced, not the pain and scandal, but the warmth of her laugh, the way she rode bareback under a midnight sky, fearless and free. "You only heal in places that hurt," Daisy used to say. "That's how you know you're alive." Lila smiled softly, feeling that truth finally settle in her bones. She closed her eyes and listened, not just to the wind, but to the quiet strength in her own heart. She realized she'd learned more from this land than from any city or classroom. That defying indifference is its own kind of bravery. That loving means letting go, even when it breaks you. That the fight for what's right inspires others, and every silent witness who finally speaks up adds to the chorus of change. That healing is slow, but possible, for both horses and people. As night fell, lanterns glowed along Main Street, and the music of a local band drifted across the desert. Lila walked back toward the lights, the dust swirling around her boots, and realized the desert had given her a gift, a place to begin again, and the courage to make it count. She promised herself she would not waste it. She would honor Daisy, Shadow Dancer, and every soul who needed a voice. One stand had started a wave. Now she would help others find their own. 6 months had passed since the night the desert storm swept away Dustwell's secrets. Autumn settled over Nevada with cool, golden mornings and crisp, starlit nights. The town was quieter now, less burdened by old shadows. Some wounds still ached, but healing was underway, slow and steady, just like the desert's own renewal after rain. Lila's property had changed too. What once was a battered, lonely shelter had become a modest sanctuary, a place where broken things found a second chance. The new sign out front read, "Desert Sanctuary for Horses and Hope." Fresh boards patched the old corral. Wildflowers climbed along the fence, and the distant laughter of children drifted through open windows. Lila worked sunrise to sunset, her hands rough and her heart full. Sometimes, when she looked around at the sturdy paddocks, the grain bins filled by community donations, and the gently milling horses, she could hardly believe what they'd built. Meredith was always there, her quick wit and steady hands as vital as ever. She'd split her time between her clinic and the sanctuary, mentoring the next generation of local vets and speaking openly about animal welfare at town meetings. She and Lila made a good team. If there was tension or regret about the past, it had faded into a strong, gentle partnership, anchored by hard-won trust. Most afternoons, after the chores were finished, Lila sat with the kids who came to help. Some were the same faces who'd run beside her through the storm: Mariah, Jonah, and now a handful of their friends. They groomed horses, mucked stalls, and learned how to read the quiet signs of pain or comfort in a nervous animal. They listened as Lila told them stories, not only about Shadow Dancer, but about courage, loss, and what it meant to do the right thing when nobody else would. One Saturday, Lila gathered the kids in the shade of the barn and passed around cool lemonade. She looked at each of them, seeing herself at their age, unsure, hungry for purpose, longing for belonging. "Sometimes," she told them, "you get a chance to change things. Not because you're looking for trouble, but because trouble finds you. The real choice is what you do next. If you speak up, you might stand alone at first, but that's how change starts." They listened, wide-eyed, as she described how compassion wasn't weakness, but a kind of grit, the courage to care in a world that often looked away. "Every act of kindness matters," she finished quietly, "even if you're the only one who sees it." Later, as the sun dipped low and painted the land in gold and rose, Meredith joined Lila at the fence line. They watched the horses grazing, content and safe. There were new rescues: a battered gray mare from a shuttered racing stable, a colt born with a twisted leg, now running free after months of rehab. Lila leaned against the rail, content in a way she'd never thought possible. A familiar shape appeared on the horizon: Shadow Dancer, wild and strong, his black mane tossing in the evening wind. He'd never stayed long, always vanishing into the desert after a brief visit. But each time he returned, it felt like a benediction, proof that freedom and healing were real. Today, he paused by the fence, his eyes meeting Lila's. She felt the ache of longing, but more than that, a fierce pride. She called softly, "Thank you, old friend." Shadow Dancer nickered, pawed the earth, then turned and loped away, disappearing into the sage. As dusk fell, the sanctuary filled with gentle sounds: hooves and straw, young voices, laughter, and the whir of Meredith's old radio playing country tunes. Lila sat on the porch, sipping tea, letting herself remember, not just the pain, but the journey. She thought of Daisy, of every loss and every small victory, the fear, the doubt, and the moments she'd almost given up. She realized now the desert had given her more than trials. It had taught her endurance, the beauty of small joys, and the possibility of redemption, not just for herself, but for a whole community. Dustwell had changed, but so had she. Sometimes at night, when the stars shone cold and bright, Lila wrote in her journal, hopes for the sanctuary, memories of her sister, plans for a future she'd never dared to imagine. She dreamed of traveling to nearby towns, speaking out, teaching others what she'd learned. There were still people, still horses, who needed help. The work would never end, but it no longer felt lonely. The kids called her Miss Lila now, and folks from all over came by to donate supplies or volunteer. Even Sheriff Collier brought his grandchildren, grinning sheepishly as he helped muck stalls. The town's silence had broken. People remembered Shadow Dancer's story, and Daisy's too, and they used those memories to guide their own choices. On the anniversary of Shadow Dancer's rescue, Lila and Meredith hosted a gathering at the sanctuary. The entire community came, some to celebrate, others to ask for forgiveness, all to honor the new beginning. Lila stood before them, voice strong and clear. Sometimes the bravest thing you can do is stand alone in the desert, hoping you're not the only one who cares. But if you keep standing, if you keep caring, you'll find you're not alone after all. She finished with a lesson she hoped everyone would remember. One person's courage can start something bigger. It can rescue a life, a heart, even a whole community's soul. As the stars blinked awake and laughter mingled with the desert wind, Lila knew she was home, not just in Dustwell, but in the circle of people who had learned, at last, that kindness could change the world.